Hello property navigators. We have a huge video today all about the future of the housing market here in Australia, with a focus on our surging population and how this might affect our property values into the future. Now, I'm not here to push my views on you, but the fact is, once you listen to this video, and if you are an investor, it'll be scary for you to see the shortfall in our housing supply. And the only positive side of the coin is if you are buying property, the severe demand will be overwhelming. Let's dive right into the heart of the matter with the latest Housing Affordability Index from PropTrack. The new Housing Affordability Index from PropTrack has been revealed and the data is startling. It shows that right now is the worst time as far as data has ever been measured as to the affordability for those looking to get into the property market. So the verdict is that 50% of people in our country, their household income can only actually afford 13% of the homes that are on the market. To compare, in order for the market to be considered affordable, you need 50% of people's household income in this country to be able to afford 50% of the homes sold over the previous year, which last happened in about 1999. So it's been a tough couple of decades. While the index isn't a direct signal to buy or not to buy, it certainly prompts a deeper look into the reasons behind the soaring prices and why, unfortunately, housing prices are expected to climb even higher. Firstly, let's consider Australia's population growth and the corresponding need for housing. Why do we bother about population forecasts, I hear you ask? Because everybody needs a place to live. Therefore, there is no industry more directly linked to demographics than the property and housing market. If we have more people in the country, then we need more dwellings to put those people in. And then depending on what kind of age and what kind of income structure and jobs these people have, then we need to add adequate housing stock to cater for those specific segments of the population. And if you know what is coming, you can buy into the right suburbs and into the right types of properties that people might be interested in. The size of the population is excellent news in Australia as we have been growing. We have been growing around 300 to 400,000 people per year over the last couple of decades, and this is very, very strong growth. Around 1/3 of our population growth comes from what's called natural increase figures, which is the yearly births minus deaths in the country. And about 2/3 of our population growth comes from migrants from overseas, which is why migration is such a big topic here in Australia. So let's discuss a little more about how migration works. If we look at the forecasts, you might ask, how the hell do we know what the future looks like? But we actually have a really clear understanding in demographics of how many babies are being born every year. We also have a really clear understanding of how many people die every year. So we get what is called natural increase figures. So we know how much Australia is growing just on births and deaths. But we also dictate how many people we let into our country. So we have an immigration system to decide who's allowed to come and live here. So we get to basically pick and choose. We let any international student in who is talented enough and who has enough money to pay for their own education. Economically speaking, they're a great deal because they spend a ton of money to study and live here that they privately fund. Then 1 in 6 of those well-educated international students will later become a permanent resident who will make a stellar contribution to our economy over their lifetime. So this is really good for us. We also have a skilled migration list. Now, the government puts the skilled jobs they think we require more of in our country on this list and how many that they think we might need. Then over time, people come from abroad and they apply. And if they're successful in their application and the process our government makes them go through, then they can come into Australia and live and work in that skilled role. Once this quota of skilled migrants for each role is reached, then we have to take that role off the list. And in the meantime, those skilled migrants have popped up in our country's workforce. So that's how we know how many people are coming. It's called the net overseas migration figure. That just means how many migrants come into the country additionally every single year. So let's look at Australia's past and future population growth. This is Matusic's chart based on the Australian Bureau of Statistics and the official government treasury. And what it's showing is Australia's projected annual population growth. In 2024, we will have 450,000 people migrate to Australia. Now, this is down from 2023, where we had over 500,000 new people coming into Australia. It goes down to about 400,000 for every year thereafter for the next 10 years. But just look at this. 2024 to 2026, that's another million people in Australia. 26 to 29, another million people. 2030 to 2032, another million people. So just over this period of the next 9 years, we're getting another 3 to 4 million people in Australia. The key point here is that we have been having very high migration levels, particularly since middle of the 2000s. We had a bit of a pause in the pandemic, but coming out of that, we've seen immigration levels really surge to very rapid growth. AMP's chief economist Shane Oliver says that we're seeing population growth in the last financial year that is so high, it has only ever been surpassed back in the 1950s. The reality of all this migration is that all of these people need places to live, and the way it's looking, they won't. One major problem about this situation in Australia is that the net migration figures, being skilled migration list and the targets of how many people we let into our country, well, this is a separate set of policies than our housing policies. These two policies should probably be developed together or at least analysed together. You cannot have the Treasurer saying, yeah, well, look, we'll take in another 50,000 more migrants than we thought we would because that'd make our economy great and really drive our GDP. Well, it does, and jobs get filled and it's all good, but we have to have enough properties being built for these people to live in. Well, that's why there's a housing crisis situation that we are in right now in Australia, because the conversation wasn't had 5, 10 or even longer years ago. So this population growth is making an already very difficult situation even worse. And when I say even worse, in very basic terms, I'm talking about the shortfall of housing in Australia. It is fair to say right now that what we end up with and have ended up with is a very, very tight market for both buying and in particular, renting a house. Now, if we think we're in a crisis now, well, let's just wait a few years because that's when we'll be in a proper crisis. That's when it's going to get a lot worse. We already have record low vacancy rates and rental housing in many cities around Australia. Now, estimates from Shane Oliver, AMP's chief economist, have mentioned by June next year, we'll have a shortfall of somewhere between 165,000 and 285,000 dwellings, depending on what's happening with household size, which we knew shrunk and fell dramatically through the pandemic. So each year in Australia, we've got capacity to build about 200,000 homes. In fact, 200,000 homes was the 5-year average up until last year in 2022. So if building 200,000 dwellings is our capacity, he estimates that the underlying demand is now running at about 220,000 with these very high migration levels. This means that every single year we're building 20,000 less homes than we actually need, and that adds on to the shortage of housing we already have. So as time goes by, the situation will only get worse. Now, it's great to see our government's focusing on boosting supply, and there's all sorts of question marks around that, which I won't get into now. But as long as we maintain these very high levels of immigration, we'll be chasing our tail to some degree, and we won't really solve the problem that we have. So it's essentially now left up to investors, like us, to bridge the housing gap, and we have to work fast at it. The Australian government is forecasting that within about 50 years, Australia's population is going to be sitting at over 60 million people. Now, that's over double our current population. Imagine that. Now, when you break down the ABS data, over 75% of that growth will be between Sunshine Coast and Melbourne. So Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane being the capital cities that will be getting the lion's share of that population growth. Not only is that population growth expected to be in those 3 geographical locations, but this is also where the majority of the infrastructure growth is going to come from, because these areas have so many people moving to them that at the moment this forces the government to spend a lot of their money on upgrading the roads, train lines, hospitals, universities, and also improving the central business districts of all of these different locations. So they really do need to keep moving in terms of infrastructure and projects to support such a huge population increase. But they still don't have a solid and proven plan for how we will solve the current housing crisis. So again, this is left to investors to pick up the slack. And lastly, to bring all of this together, let's look at our housing supply. Now, looking at the supply, it's just fallen off a cliff. Now, annual dwelling completions were pretty high in 2017, but that was the highest we've got, and then a big drop down, even despite all of the home grants and all the construction grants that the federal government gave during COVID to boost the construction industry. Now, despite this, it is still down. And you might think, well, it's still higher than back in 2009. It's still higher than 2013. But back then we had 200,000 new immigrants per year, not 400 to 500,000. So there's absolutely no comparison. Now, it's just not new houses that aren't being built fast enough. It's also the current number of listings. So the 5-year average of the number of listings of established houses for sale in Australia is the red line that's on the graph on screen now, from January all the way to December. This is PropTrack data, which is a part of the realestate.com.au group, and you can see in 2022 this blue line was well below the 5-year average, and in 2023 right now this green line is basically the same as last year. So we're so far below long-term averages. There's just hardly anything decent for sale at all. So let's break down the data state by state using Matusik's chart. Now the shortfall is evident everywhere, with some states facing more acute crisis than others. Whether it's New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, Western Australia or the Northern Territory, each presents a unique challenge in balancing housing supply and demand. Imagine extrapolating these projections out using the forecasted population growth data over the next 10 or 20 years. How huge will our housing shortfall be? Well, it won't be looking good. On a final note about demographics, remember, when looking at population growth and demographic data, that the population isn't evenly distributed across the whole age spectrum. For example, a lot of our international students are going to be in their early 20s and will probably be looking at unit or apartment living. So knowing the age ranges can help to forecast what kind of property-specific dwellings might be in demand and when. Therefore, a lot of data analysis is needed to get down into the granular details in order to be well informed. Now, if you've enjoyed this video, check this one out here. Reckon you'll love it. All right, we hope this video has helped you understand Australia's growing population, how this relates to our current and future housing supply challenges, and how this poses significant questions and opportunities in the years ahead. Until next time, happy property navigating.